All right, hello everyone, and welcome to 1999, the year in film, which, my God, 25 years ago. Yeah, I joke that math is offensive, but the older I get, the more offensive it is to me. Because I was a movie-going teenager in 1999, and now I've had to add those 2 years. I've had to add that age plus 25 and get like, oh God. Todd and I actually went to go see Y2K on Friday, and imagine my shock and sadness when I realized that all of the young stars for that movie, not one of them was even born in the year 1999. They were all 2001 and younger. I'm like, oh man. But yeah, this is a very great year for film. I don't want to say it's one of the last great or it's the last great year for film because I think there are still some other ones in there, but one of the reasons we're doing this is because you kind of need a little bit of that distance to truly appreciate how impactful this year was. One moment, I'm just going to get PowerPoint ready to go. Slideshow. All right, so here we are, 1999, the year in film. So, why are we talking about 1999? Like, why is this particular year important? Well, there are certain movies where in certain years where a number of movies come out that really come to define the year itself, and in some cases, a generation. You could also look at 1967 is a fairly groundbreaking year for Hollywood that gave us Bonnie and Clyde and The Graduate. Todd, I'm right. The Graduate was 67, right?
Let me double check on that. One sec,
Yeah,
please.
I'm pretty sure. But yeah, you have these movies that come out, or 1977, completely defined by the release of Star Wars, or 1982. People think about not only E.T. coming out that year, but now you think about stuff like, oh, The Thing came out that year, Blade Runner came out that year. A lot of classic movies came out in one year. So that's why it's interesting to look back on this stuff and see like how many iconic movies came out in one year that are modern cinema classics. And again, I think the 25 years is a good amount of distance for us to be able to objectively look at this stuff. So, um, we're going to talk about the titles that everyone was looking forward to, Phantom Menace, speaking of Star Wars, and then we're going to look at some of the little movies that ended up really becoming cultural juggernauts, and including one movie that completely changed Hollywood in many ways. So, a book I'm going to be reading from is the book Best Movie Year Ever: How 1999 Blew Up the Big Screen. It's a good read overall. I have my critiques of it. I think there are certain movies he could have gone into a little more, but nobody's perfect. But if you're looking for a good kind of compendium and an overview of how stacked of a year this was cinematically, I would really recommend reading this book. I believe that we have it at least somewhere in the consortium. And if we don't, you can come to the Derry Public Library information desk and I can put a purchase request in. So we are going to start off with the movie that I think more than any other film that came out in 1999 changed the cinema landscape in so many ways, and that is the Wachowskis' The Matrix. Um, so keep in mind that early in the year 1999, there were some trailers for this, and it was just no one can be told what The Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. And that was enough people to get really interested. So Todd, you have an interesting story regarding this movie versus other 1999 films.
So before I start that, I do want to follow up. Yes, The Graduate was 67.
Okay, thank you. My brain was just like, are you absolutely sure?
So I'll just put it this way. There is a piece of ephemera from my teenage years that I have hung on to because I feel like it makes a great sort of cautionary piece. It is an old issue of Cinescape from like their summer of 1999, essentially their coming attractions magazine. Now, big things splashed across the front cover. You've got stuff like The Phantom Menace, Wild Wild West. It's the Austin Powers 2, the big stuff of the season. The Matrix is in there, but it's like it's this short little article about like, is anybody really expecting this thing's going to be huge? No one's really sure what this is. It's kind of an unknown
Yep.
property at this point.
Back when Hollywood invested in unknown properties. Yeah, this was a movie that I mean, to say that the studio didn't have a lot of faith in it actually isn't true. So, yes, it was released on March 31st, and to give you some background, there are dumping ground months in film release schedules. August is often seen as a dumping ground month. January and February are often seen as dumping ground months, and March can kind of fall into that. But as you're getting closer to the spring and summer, it tends to be a little more favorable. But you could tell with the placement of March 31st, the studio, Warner Brothers, was still kind of like, we're not quite sure how much money this will make, so let's make sure there's no big competition. This was only the Wachowskis' technically third movie. They had a sleeper hit with the lesbian crime thriller Bound that with Gina Gershon and Jennifer Tilly. Great movie if you haven't seen it. It just got into the Criterion Collection. Also, if you loved this year's Love Lies Bleeding, please go watch Bound. But these were still young, scrappy filmmakers, but they had an idea. There were enough executives at Warner Brothers who were like, okay, an original sci-fi property that's influenced by stuff like anime, Hong Kong films, cyberpunk stuff. Let's give it a shot. Some other context is right now, like 1999, this was just around the time anime was starting to have its second wave of success in the United States. And I think that probably helped the studio executives maybe go, let's take a shot on this. But yeah, if you don't know what The Matrix is about, it's about a young man named Neo who realizes he is living in a simulation. The machines have taken over the planet. They are using humans as battery fuel, essentially. And a guy named Morpheus helps take him out of the Matrix and fight the machines. This is a movie, again, I could not see this being released in a big screen, like a multiplex now. I feel like this is something that a studio would just go, send it to Netflix, send it to streaming. And who knows what kind of cultural footprint it would have. But in 1999, this movie came out, and again, the ad campaign for this was good. It showed you some of the action scenes, and it had that tagline of no one can be told what the Matrix is. It's a little ominous. It gets you, but it's enticing. It gets you interested. So this movie opens on March 31st, and it makes 28 million that weekend. This shocked Warner Brothers, and this shocked a lot of people in Hollywood. They kind of figured, we don't know how this is going to do. The projection was probably around like 15 to 20 million. And also keep in mind, back then, the studios would not yank a movie if it didn't make $100 million in the first weekend. They would let movies stay and have longevity. And The Matrix was a film that had longevity because people were going to see it and then they were coming back and telling their other friends, you have to see this movie. And so for some further context, I said this is influenced by stuff like Hong Kong films, kung fu movies. A lot of people, I know I, as a 13-year-old, had not seen that stuff yet. Had never, this was a year before Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. So for us, the fight scenes in this movie were mind-blowing, and they were for a lot of Americans. So this was a huge breath of fresh air. But kind of sort of unfortunately, like a lot of things, Hollywood then decides this needs to be a franchise immediately. People have feelings about the sequels. I have warmed up to Reloaded and Revolutions a bit. I actually really like Matrix Resurrections because it's Lana Wachowski taking $200 million of Warner Brothers money to give them the middle finger. It's kind of great. But this is almost a little, in a way, not quite a little, but this is the sci-fi movie that could, and this is something that a lot of studios do not take chances on anymore. They don't say, okay, we're going to give you a modest budget for an original property movie, and we're actually going to promote it and see if it makes money. So again, great movie if you've never seen it. Also, March 31st date. Look at that date. If you're familiar with the April of 1999, what happened, Todd, about 3 weeks later?
Let's just say those trench coats got kind of an infamous
Yes,
reputation.
it did. But this was a case, and actually, I believe the Matrix people tried to pin Columbine on the Matrix at first, but there was no evidence for that. But it was one where executives were kind of looking at that and going like, woo, thank goodness we chose March, because if we had chosen May or April, we would have been completely screwed. Controversy might have completely bagged the film. So this is another example of sometimes timing just works really well. And actually, this will not be the first or last time we talk about a movie that was affected by the tragedy at Columbine. So moving on to another little movie that could, The Blair Witch Project. Um, Again, this is a movie that original project and made for a really cheap budget, $60,000. These were independent filmmakers. They had an idea, a very simple concept. Three people went missing in search of a rumored local witch, and now the footage was found. Um, Granted, this is not the first found footage of this type of movie. That would actually be Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust. But you can't show that movie in some places because there's animal cruelty depicted on screen. Also, not to slag on the creators of the Blair Witch Project, but call me when you actually get hauled into court and have to prove your actors aren't dead. See some of our past programs for our discussions on Cannibal Holocaust and the legal saga that went with that. But when this movie came out, once again, this is a case of, I don't want to say once upon a time, studios cared about promotion, but the promo for this really hyped up this mystery. And it helped that the cast, these weren't professional actors. So there was this idea of, is this real? Is this based on something real? What did happen to these people? Now, granted, if you think about this for more than like 2 minutes, you're going to realize, oh, wait, there's no way that this would be released as a feature film. This would be in a police evidence locker. But still, that's a hook that gets people, and it especially got horror fans. So this movie premiered in Sundance of January 99. It was picked up almost immediately, and it was out July of 99. And if you know anything about the festival circuit, the turnaround for that isn't that quick unless that studio has faith in that movie. Sometimes there's almost a year between gets picked up at a festival, gets released. Um, there is unfortunately some stuff about how the actors were treated on in this film. Mainly, they were not paid a lot, and they have certainly not seen the amount of revenues that the studio that purchased this movie had. But it is still up there in terms of, number one, again, a studio taking a risk on an unknown movie. And also, this was on the heels of, by the end of the 90s, horror, I don't want to say it had become lazy, but it had become kind of franchised out, sort of where we are right now with just any franchise at this point. It's just Scream had become a franchise, Freddy's a franchise, the Hellraiser franchise, Jason's a franchise. Again, this was the breath of fresh air. And it's also, again, how a good marketing gimmick can get people interested in seeing a film. And also just look at those numbers. Overall, this thing cost $750,000 to make, and it made, and keep in mind, this is 1999 money, $250 million. This is one of the most successful movies ever made. And again, this was just a couple of people with cameras in the woods. And so the third real success story of 1999 is The Sixth Sense. Now, I'm going to get this out of the way. For a lot of people, M. Night Shyamalan has become a bit of a punchline, kind of in some ways by his own doing. But go back to 1999, no one who knew who this guy was. And he had a couple of small movies that weren't very good under his belt, and he did this spec script. David Vogel at Disney saw the script, loved it, bought the rights. And Bruce Willis, he had been in some trouble with Disney. He had essentially walked off a picture, And they said, okay, well, so we won't sue you. You have to do a couple of other movies for us. And one of these movies was The Sixth Sense. Willis went in not entirely enthusiastic, and then Willis read the script, and he probably had more faith than anyone else in it. At some point, pull this out. This is from Best Movie Year Ever. Not everyone shared Willis's confidence. Before filming The Sixth Sense was completed in late 1998, the filmmakers learned that Disney, hoping to insure itself against any losses for the reportedly $40 million film, had sold off the rights to an outside production company to lessen the financial risk. Though Disney would still distribute The Sixth Sense, the decision felt like, quote, the ultimate vote of no confidence, says Mendel, which is one of the producers. So imagine late 1998, you're M. Night Shyamalan, you're people working on this movie, and you see that. Flash forward to August of 1999. And again, keep in mind, August considered the dumping ground month of summer. The last real gasp of summer for a big movie is July. August is where you put the stuff where you're like, I think this is going to die. Just get it out of here. This movie makes a ton of money. It's one of the biggest hits of the year. It stayed in theaters for almost 8 months total, I believe. Because back then back in my day, there used to be a whole thing called second run theaters. But this movie was a phenomenon, and there was this whole thing of kind of harkening back to films like Psycho, where it was like, don't give away the twist of this movie. This is the movie all of America is talking about, but don't tell anybody the ending. Once again, kind of ginning up this, genuine word of mouth from moviegoers of, I can't tell you how this movie ends. You have to see it yourself. And I went into this movie pretty blind. It was at a drive-in theater. I don't know what the other movie was. I don't remember it, but I remember watching The Sixth Sense and being floored at the end of the movie. My defense, I was 13 years old. But yeah, again, I mean, thank goodness Disney kind of distributed the film and they got some money for it. But you got to imagine, like, after the opening on August, like the weekend of August 6th, they're probably just like, oh, geez, I wish we didn't sell the rights off to this. So, I mean, this becomes a big hit. This also launches M. Night Shyamalan into, he's the new director to get. He's the one that everyone wants to make other movies. But unfortunately, he gets the reputation as being the twist guy. Every one of his movies has to have a twist, and sometimes that works. I think Unbreakable works really well. I think Signs, it works pretty decently. But as his movies went on, they got a little more gimmicky and convoluted and not in a good way. And he's kind of come back and reinvented himself as a modern day just B-movie filmmaker. And frankly, I think his movies are a lot better for it. Everyone should watch the movie Old. It's hilarious. There is a character called Midsize Sedan in it. I love it. And I heard Trap was actually a lot of fun. I think Knock at the Cabin, it goes on too long, but there's good dramatic tension in it. I will always maintain Shyamalan is a good director. I just think he tried to mold himself for what Hollywood wanted him to be, and once he stepped away from that, I think he became a better filmmaker. So now that we've got the three like surprise success stories out of the way, let's take a look at a disappointment. So Todd, where were you when you saw The Phantom Menace?
Oh, geez, that theater is still there. No, because I was actually kind of surprised. They were like, "What's that?" Oh no, because yeah, I saw that at the. It was the Solomon Mall Theater down in Mass, which
Oh,
changed hands, but it is still in existence.
yeah,
Yeah.
I was gonna say the Tower Theater, the old little independent cinema in South Hadley, where I've seen many a movie, is still there as well. Um, I love Star Wars. I still like the original trilogy of Star Wars. I'm kind of Star Warsed out. Doesn't have much to do with this, but oh boy, was I excited for this film. I saved up my allowance and babysitting and plant watering money to buy like every Entertainment Weekly, Vanity Fair premiere thing about this. This was at the time the most anticipated movie ever. If you were around for this, I'm sure you remember the hype for it. And this was one where we were already waiting 6 years for this. George Lucas said in 93, he's like, okay, I'm starting to work on episode one, how Anakin Skywalker even became Darth Vader in the first place. And we're going to see young Obi-Wan Kenobi, and we're going to see, the mother of Luke and Leia, et cetera, et cetera. People were so hyped for this film when it came out that the trailers are going to play in front of films like Meet Joe Black and The Waterboy. People bought tickets to those movies just to watch the trailer and then left, which I don't know, man. Like, you already bought the ticket. Give the movie a shot. You may as well, but tickets were cheaper back then. So the hype train was big with this one. And then some of the advanced reviews started coming in. They're not that great. And I found this is from Richard Corliss in Time Magazine. He was talking about one of the first screenings of it. And he was like, wow, the audience was so hyped at the beginning. And then, for some reason, the audience was quieter at the end than the beginning. So yeah, this movie comes out and it is not really that much of a critical darling. It's not panned the way people say it was. It's more considered there's some hits and some misses, and the misses outnumber the hits. A lot of the reviews I've read are fairly even-handed with the movie. Jar Jar Binks is hated almost instantly by fans. Sadly, he is hated almost to the point where the actor who played him, Ahmed Best, considered taking his own life, proving that Star Wars fans being horrible is not new. But I think there's a lot of people, I was one of them, kind of hung on to that hope for a little bit, even after seeing the movie, that this movie was good. And then after a while, I'm just kind of like, no, it's not. Maybe Attack of the Clones will be better. It wasn't. But I think for a lot of us, especially if you were younger, Star Wars Episode 1 was a good lesson of maybe, just maybe, don't believe the hype. And that absolutely applies to our next film, Wild Wild West. So, little story time here. The only movie my theater my mom would let me go to alone was the Tower Theaters in South Hadley, Mass, because she's just like, oh, she can. It's like like a little two-theater place. I could walk down and just wait outside, and she could pick me up. It wasn't a huge multiplex. She's like, this is fine. Also, the possibility of me sneaking into a movie was slim to nil there. You can't really do that. So saw this here with a friend. Um, and when we get out, my mom picks us up. She asks me how the movie was, and we just look at each other and we're like, it was good. Just that moment in my life where I realized, I think at 13, that I think I have seen a really awful, awful movie. And yes, it was Wild Wild West. I think of any of the movies we're covering here, that might be the worst one. I mean, at least Phantom Menace has young Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi in a really good score. There's barely anything redeemable about Wild Wild West. The only thing I will go to bat for is the song, but that's not really a part of the movie. But this had everything going for it. Will Smith was still a huge star. He had Independence Day. He had Men in Black. He had The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. This was a guy people would pay to go see. Oh, he had Bad Boys too, as well. Kevin Kline, a very well-respected actor, an Oscar winner at this point. Um, really, in retrospect, I don't know why we thought this movie was going to be such a big hit. I think it was because it was Will Smith and it was Barry Sonnenfeld, who he had worked together with Men in Black, and Men in Black was a massive hit 2 years ago.
Oh,
So,
it was definitely that. I mean, even just
yeah.
that pairing is clearly trying to recreate the formula.
Yeah. So they do that, and this is a movie that completely bottoms out. And like Warner Brothers, Warner Brothers was a little gun shy, slightly gun shy on The Matrix, although again, that being gun shy probably worked for it, thanks to real life events. But the budget of this movie was $170 million. Again, this is 1999 money. This movie bombed. It was panned by critics. It dropped to second place the first weekend, which again, back then, blockbuster releases weren't once every other week. The way blockbuster releases worked, where there was like one movie's released, you wait a couple weeks, then release the next big blockbuster. There wasn't this constant need for the line to go up, as it were. Um, yeah, this is, I think, more than any other film, the true lesson of hype, star power. It can't save a movie. There has to be something there. And with Wild Wild West, we all saw there's nothing there. Interestingly enough, it's not even really talked about in the book. That's how little of an impact it made in terms of cultural. The only real impact is, oh, that movie was really bad. And this was kind of, I don't want to say the beginning of the downfall of Will Smith, but I think this was a nick in his armor, if that makes sense. It was realizing, oh, Will Smith alone isn't enough to sell a movie. So, from a movie that people were banking on to be huge to a movie that's become very beloved, we're going to talk about The Mummy. And I would consider that to be the true victor of the summer of 1999. Also, hey, take a look at that budget, $80 million. Granted, I will say some of the CG ain't great, but look, it was 1999. You have to accept some things in these movies are not going to look super good. This is written and directed by Steven Sommers, and it was, it's the story of the mummy, but it was conceived rather than just being a horror story as more of a nice throwback action adventure film. Has a lot of Raiders of the Lost Ark in it. It's got a lot of the 30 serials, which also influenced the Indiana Jones series in it. And it's a ton of fun. It comes out. This was another movie I saw by myself because my mom's like, I'm not watching that. I'm just going to drop you off at a theater and I'll see you in 2 hours. And made half of its initial budget back the first weekend, to the point where Brendan Fraser said, like, oh yeah, like, I mean, we were really shocked that it made that much money. The whole town was shocked it made that much money. And also, kind of jumping off of the Will Smith thing, Brendan Fraser was seen as a guy who could kind of sell a movie at this point, not to the level of Will Smith megawatt stardom, but this guy's likable. People like watching him. I think they saw him less as a star that can make you pay tickets, more of you put this guy in a movie, he gives it a watchable quality. And yeah, no, he's great in this movie. He's great. Rachel Weisz is great. I gotta say, Rick O'Connell and Evie are one of my favorite, movie couples that actually managed to not have one of them die, because I've been kind of realizing I have a pattern of a lot of my favorite ships, at least one of them ends up dead at the end. So, see, sometimes I like it when they both make it. But this was the underdog movie in a summer that gave us the Phantom Menace and Wild Wild West. And it's hung in there. I mean, there have been people who've tried to rehab the Phantom Menace to, mixed results. I think the Phantom Menace is still ultimately seen as a miss. I've seen a few people try to rehab Wild Wild West, but I think these are people who watched it when they were 5. Most people are like, no, it's a bad movie, don't try. But The Mummy has become, of the 3 big blockbusters, a beloved film. Like, people, like, when Brendan Fraser won the Oscar for The Whale, there were so many people who were like, oh my God, I love it. Rick O'Connell finally has an Oscar. So it just goes to show sometimes you really cannot predict what's going to have the lasting cultural impact when it comes out. So now we are going for kind of a downer story, but still a fairly groundbreaking film for its time, which is the film Boys Don't Cry. This came out in October, kind of for the Oscar slate, although when the movie was made, director Kimberly Pierce did not think this would be a big Oscar contender because of the subject matter. If you are not familiar with the story of Brandon Tina was a trans man who was assaulted and murdered in 1993. He had been living as a man, but once people he knew found out that he was assigned female at birth, they assaulted him and later murdered him. Pierce had talked about, and she had read that story, that she's like, I knew people who were like Brandon. We didn't even use the term trans at the time, or stuff like passing or transmasc, but she's like, I knew people who were like this. And Pierce, being queer herself, felt a real drive to want to make this movie. The movie also came out within a year of the murder of Matthew Shepard, which, if you're not familiar with that, that was a gay young man who was murdered, and a wake-up call for a lot of people who thought the 90s were it's like we're better, we're more tolerant. It's like, no, there are still places where this happens, and this stuff still happens today. Trans people are still murdered today. Um, but the reason this film was such a splash was Hilary Swank, who wasn't a big actress at this point, came out of nowhere to win Best Actress. Many people thought that would go to Annette Bening that year. But also from a larger cultural standpoint of this is one of the first times a mainstream like released Hollywood film centers on a trans person in the trans experience, and they're not portrayed as crazy, they're not portrayed as comic relief. And granted, there are other films that have treated transgender people with dignity. I think a good example of it, despite casting John Lithgow as Roberta, something we wouldn't do today, The World According to Garp is nothing but respectful to Roberta as a character, but still, she's not the main character of that film. Brandon Tina is. It's taking the story of a real person who was murdered and giving that the sympathy that it deserves. And rather than trying to paint Brandon as someone who is just confused or trying to trick somebody, it's just, this is a person who grew up, felt, though however I was born and raised does not match how I feel, and I am trying to figure my own life out, and sadly had that life ended much sooner than it did. And again, it's one where I would actually say go back and watch it, although this is another movie where it's a hard watch. I don't know how soon I'll go back to it, because the ending of that movie is brutal. But it is, I would say, absolutely worth watching, and a very relevant film for today. So one of the things I've talked about if you come to my film programs is, or you caught me at the reference desk in passing, what I lament a lot about the current state of film, and what other people like Martin Scorsese has talked about, is just the idea of a lot of film theaters now, multiplexes, they don't show a good mix of films. It's all the big franchise stuff and tentpoles and nothing else. And it's harder than ever for small, independent, and just weird little movies to get made. And if they do get released, they get released on such a small scale, you can barely see it. And then nowadays, it's usually just shuttered to streaming. But in 1999, we see two movies, Being John Malkovich and Magnolia, come out. So Being John Malkovich comes out in October, written by Charlie Kaufman, directed by Spike Jonze. It's a strange little movie. Like, if someone were to tell you the plot to this film, which is a puppeteer played by John Cusack finds a portal that lets you live in John Malkovich's brain for a little bit, you'd go like, how is that supposed to be a movie? But it is an amazingly interesting film. It talks about stuff like identity. It talks about there is gender stuff in there as well. Cameron Diaz's character, when she's in John Malkovich's mind, is like, I actually feel more natural here than I do in my regular life. It also goes into the idea of celebrity and individuality. It's a really interesting, heady movie, which I don't know. I feel like if it were made today, it wouldn't go further than like the Coolidge Corner Theater in Brookline. It might not even leave New York and LA. But John Malkovich, like, this movie actually had a somewhat modest release. I think it got to my West Springfield cinema. It was only playing, I think, one or two times a day, but it got there. Again, word of mouth and critical acclaim made it something that people wanted to go see. And again, studios decided, why not? Let's go release it. And for a lot of people, Being John Malkovich was the best movie to come out in 1999. And the other really weird and strange movie is Magnolia, which, if you're familiar with Paul Thomas Anderson, The Master, There Will Be Blood. He came out, this was off the heels of Boogie Nights, which I still think Boogie Nights is one of his best movies. Boogie Nights is so good. So he decides, I'm going to make a 3-hour melodrama of interconnected stories and characters where everyone just ends sadly. And oh, there's raining frogs. There are people in that movie who were like, I still don't quite get what that was about. So didn't make the splash at the box office that Being John Malkovich did, because for a theater owner, they're like, this is 3 hours and there's a lot of movies out right now. Again, in December, that's where you have a lot of the big holiday push. So you have holiday movies coming out, you have the Oscar push coming out. But it's still, because it was a critical hit and actually made a lot of headway on home media, it found a second life and is now considered to be one of the best American films ever made. So two other movies I would like to bring up very quickly. There's always talk about like an it girl. 1999 brought us the arrival of two it girls who went from being like somewhat known actors into in-demand actors. So the first is The Cider House Rules. This was a movie that seemed to be just made in a lab to win an Oscar. It's based on a John Irving book, which a really good John Irving book. It's a period piece. It's set in New England. Michael Caine is in it. Although, Todd, as you pointed out, this movie rehabbed Michael Caine.
Yeah, because for a while there, this was Michael Caine has always been very upfront about the fact that there were jobs he would take just because he needed the money. There's the oft famous quoted line of, "I had never seen Jaws 4, but I've seen the house it bought me, and that's nice." And
I
for a
mean,
while,
hey, people need to make money.
so for a while there, it's like he was a you need to get it's like you need to get an older British actor. He's available. This was a film that made people start looking, going, "Oh crap, Michael Caine is actually a really good actor again."
He is, and he ended up winning Best Supporting Actor for this film. I think it was the sole Oscar run for this. Again, actually, I would say it definitely feels a little dated as a movie, but again, let's just say, let's like Boys Don't Cry, huh? Really relevant film right now. But I think the longest lasting effect this film had, even more than rehabbing Michael Caine, was it gave us Charlize Theron. Now, she had been in some movies. She'd been in The Devil's Advocate. I think it was it 2 Days in the Valley? She'd been in movies. This movie, just everyone noticed her and said, "Oh, who's this girl? She's very pretty." And, unfortunately, like sometimes being pretty can end up being the kiss of death, but eventually people realize, oh, she's not just pretty, she can act her butt off. And that's why we still have her today. I love her. She's one of my favorite actresses. And similarly happened with Girl Interrupted. So Girl Interrupted is even more interesting because the star of that film was Winona Ryder, who spent a good amount of the 90s being the it girl. She was the like Gen X Reality Bites kind of goth girl in the early 90s, even into the mid 90s. But I wouldn't say her star was on the decline, but we know how Hollywood treats women once they like hit 30. All of a sudden we're just playing grandmothers now. So this was kind of seen as this is a way to get people to notice Winona Ryder again, see that she can act, see that she doesn't have to just be like a Tim Burton-y type. Angelina Jolie plays a supporting role and steals all of the attention away from her. And actually, again, hey, ends up winning Best Supporting Actress for that year. But if you ever want to see a great example of a movie being stolen by a supporting performer, it's Angelina Jolie in that movie. And this was, again, a movie that made her inescapable for years to come. So 1999 was also a big year for teen movies. Now, granted, teens are always a reliable, or have been for the most part, a reliable block for Hollywood. Teens want to go see movies. They're just starting to have their own income, and where are their parents going to let them go? Oh, movie theater's okay. Um, but 1999 in particular had a ton of movies aimed at teens. Some of them are rated too. So clearly it wasn't just 15-year-olds seeing these movies, although let me tell you, as someone who got into a number of R-rated movies, a lot of theaters did not care to check your ticket unless it was some really bad stuff in there. Like they would check your ticket for Eyes Wide Shut. They were not checking your ticket for Varsity Blues. They're like, we don't care. Go ahead. We just need money. So we had Varsity Blues, $52 million. She's All That, $63 million. Cruel Intention, $38 million. 10 Things I Hate About You, $38 million. That unfortunately released the same day as The Matrix. Oops. Like the Matrix ate 10 Things I Hate About You's lunch, which is a shame because I think of these 5 movies, 10 Things I Hate About You is the best one. And then American Pie comes out in July, $102 million for kind of a gross out horn dog comedy. Again, speaking of things they don't make that much of anymore, that's again a really good amount, and that get launched a whole franchise for that as well. But we also had edgier teen movies that came out in 1999 that did not do well. So we had Rushmore, which is for many people, it's not his debut feature, that's Bottle Rocket, but Rushmore is kind of seen as the true arrival of Wes Anderson for a lot of film goers. Um, had a like, but hey, 17 million on a $9 million budget, and there was a lot of buzz on that. I actually tried to get my mom to take me to see that, and she's like, no, that looks weird. And it was playing in Northampton. And she goes, I'm not driving up to Northampton. You're on your own. So I had to wait for video for that. Jawbreaker became a cult hit afterwards. I love Jawbreaker dearly. Election, which is a great movie, one of the great movies to come out of 1999. And this is interesting because it was released by MTV Pictures. And so if you're talking about the way I go back to the way I said The Matrix, Blair Witch Project, The Sixth Sense were advertised. Election was horribly advertised. Todd, do you remember the advertising campaign for Election?
Not really. I'm gonna be honest. It really fully came across my radar. Of all places, I think my mother actually saw it before I did. It was a rented as a you guys got to see this.
Oh, cool. Yeah, no. So MTV Films, they really hyped up the MTV-ness of it, but what MTV watching kid is going to want to watch a movie about a school election? They really should have marketed as what it was, which was a satirical comedy about popularity and merit versus oh God, like, merit versus just, I think again, merit versus popularity is a good way to put it. Really great performance by Reese Witherspoon. I would still say her best performance is this film. If I had to save one performance from her, it'd be in Show the Aliens. Like, it's her as Tracy Flick. And if they ever make Tracy Flick Can't Win into a movie, they can still cast her. It'd be perfect. But yeah, this was a movie that a lot of critics liked, but because the marketing was so mismanaged, they tried to aim it to teens when they should have been aiming it at adults. And again, this is thankfully another movie that kind of on the home media circuit found a second life. Drop Dead Gorgeous, another movie that I love. A very mean movie. It's about a beauty pageant where let's just say someone's very competitive. Dick, also starring Kirsten Dunst. Wow, Drop Dead Gorgeous, Dick, and Virgin Suicides, all starring Kirsten Dunst. Came out. Dick is not great, but it's got its clever moments in there. Also, Michelle Williams, before she became again one of the best actresses working today, is in it. It's a cute little movie. I would watch it. And then The Virgin Suicides has its premiere in 1999. It didn't get a full wide release until next year, and that was a movie I wanted to see. And I asked my parents if I could go, and let's just say now that I'm an adult, I can understand why they were adamantly refusing, and now I can understand why they would not want a 14-year-old to go see a movie about 15 girls who commit suicide. But that movie is notable as that is the arrival of Sofia Coppola as a director and as one of the next big things directing wise. And mind you, Sofia Coppola had been a punchline for a few years because of her not very good performance in Godfather Part 3. So this was not only her arrival as a filmmaker, this was her chance to reinvent herself, and she has, and I think still makes great films. Much better than her dad's movies, but we'll talk about that next in our next program. We talk about Megalopolis not being very good. So now we're going to talk about a couple of films that, sort of as I've been hinting at with a movie like Election, movies that did not do well when they were released, but became cult classics and in many cases just seen as masterpieces now, thanks to stuff like home media and repeated plays on television. And the first one I'm going to talk about is The Iron Giant. If you have not seen The Iron Giant, do not let the fact that it is an animated film fool you. This movie is a masterpiece. It is one of the best films of 1999. I actually think it's one of the best American animated movies ever made. What this movie does in about 85 minutes is astounding. And I think were it not an animated movie, it would get a lot more respect. Um, Granted, it still has plenty, but there are still, I think, a lot of people who just see animation and their eyes glaze over and they think, oh, it just must be something for kids. I don't need to watch it. I would say give this movie a shot. This movie is fantastic. It is based on a Ted Hughes book called The Iron Man. It's directed by Brad Bird, which we might know from like The Incredibles. He did the screen story. Tom McCanley's did the screenplay. One of the things I love about this movie is it's set in the 50s. It's set in the Cold War. The movie has a look and feel where it almost feels like an old-fashioned 50s film. Um, so this is, I guess the best way to describe it is a boy finds a robot. It came from space. We never quite know where the robot's from. We just know what it can potentially do. But this boy decides this robot's his friend, and the robot learns to have feelings and learns about life and death. It's a great movie. My God, at the 75-minute mark, you're going to be crying. Mark my words if you watch this. But this movie almost didn't see the light of day. So the previous year, Warner Brothers had released another animated feature. I mean, studios were always trying to compete with Disney post-Disney Renaissance. And there really wasn't a true challenger until DreamWorks came along with Shrek a few years later. But Warner Brothers put out this little movie called Quest for Camelot, which was a failure, and it deserved to be a failure because it was terrible. But then the studio was like, I don't know if we really want to even support this film. And this movie almost did not make it because, again, like Warner Brothers and just, Todd, you know what this shows me? Warner Brothers really never knows how to handle good things, does it?
Their track record is there's certain times you have to look and go, happy accidents.
The but anyway, it took support from writers and industry professionals to really save this film. So, February 1st, 1999, Drew McQueenie, who from the Dearly Departed podcast 80s All Over, he was writing for Ain't It Cool News at the time. So February 1st, he says, quote, right now, somewhere in Glendale, there's a whole group of heroes working tirelessly to finish an extraordinary gem of a picture, a very special film that deserves, in my opinion, to be one of the year's biggest hits. Unfortunately, there are forces in play on the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank that threaten to undermine this movie, forces that are working against their own best interests. What will Warner Brothers be? The villains or the heroes? And so it started with that. Even the LA Times eventually caught on to it, and they wrote, Warner Brothers may not have realized how good of a film it had. And that is exactly what happened. The crew was able to finish the movie, but Warner Brothers put it in the dumping ground with next to no real advertising, and it got swamped by The Sixth Sense. Everyone was just going to see that movie. And it limped out of theaters. I don't even think it made 10 million in its run. But Cartoon Network would rerun the movie, and it would even have like an Iron Giant day, like one day of the year. And it got a following, and it also made a good amount of money on home media because people are like, "Oh, what'll I buy my kid to watch? Iron Giant. It's 90 minutes. I'll try it." And in the 25 years since then, it has become a beloved animated masterpiece. And again, I am just glad there were journalists that decided to vocally defend this film and get it out there because this movie is wonderful and I think everybody should watch it. It's a beautiful film, even if you aren't watching it with children. It's a great watch. If anything, it's my true recommendation of this program. So, on to Office Space, another film that if you were to ask someone how much money this made at the box office now, they'd be like, oh, this was a hit, right? Not at all. I mean, this is the movie that made the red stapler a thing. This movie bombed at the box office. And this is even going off of, again, to say names can't always sell a movie. A lot of the promo for this focused on the fact that it's from Mike Judge, who he had Beavis and Butthead and King of the Hill on television, and he had just made Beavis and Butthead Do America. There was this idea of like, oh yeah, Mike Judge is going to sell this movie, but apparently Americans weren't quite in the mood for a film about corporate malaise. Which is interesting because as the years went on and repeated viewings on Comedy Central and people going to the video stores to check it out, more and more people latched onto this movie and were like, oh yeah, no, I do relate to the characters in this film. Um, Again, I see this as we have so many films that come out, especially on streaming, that are barely seen by anybody, and they never even really have a chance to have a cultural impact versus, 25 years ago, which really isn't that much time. Movies were allowed to have a full second life thanks to stuff like physical media and home media, video rental stores, and repeated showings on television. And because the media landscape has changed so much, and because stuff has become so, what you see now, if you open Netflix, is so curated to you, there's less of a chance of discovery. So when I see the stories of something like Office Space or something like The Iron Giant, I wonder, had these movies come out this year, would they have even found an audience at all? And I unfortunately think the answer is no. But then again, I think not having job satisfaction is something that is evergreen. So potentially it would have found something. Also, again, being released in February, right around Valentine's Day, probably didn't help it. But again, this is another movie that eventually found its audience, and it's now, you will have people quoting it as if it was one of the biggest movies to come out that year. If anything, I think people quote Office Space more than they quote something like American Pie. I feel like that has more. I mean, would you agree, Todd, that this seems to have more actual cultural relevance?
Oh, no question. I mean,
Mhm.
also tangential to this, for a guy who's been like character actor in so many things, this is like the definitive Stephen Root role, is it safe to
Oh,
say?
you're right. Yeah, he's so if you're not familiar with Stephen Root, he is Milton, the very the quiet man who loves his red stapler and ends up burning the building down at the end of the film. Um but yeah, no, this is a fun movie. I'm a big fan of it. And now we're gonna go to probably the biggest success story involving home media, which is Fight Club. Well, we'll get to other parts of Fight Club a little later, but I love this story. When I was reading Best Movie Year Ever, David Fincher said he saw this movie as an heir to The Graduate. And when asked to explain why, it's like, well, these are disaffected men who don't quite know what their future is, don't quite know where they fit into the world, and they're trying to find their place in it. Only instead of the arms of Mrs. Robinson, they find it via violence. So this was a movie that was kind of buried by Fox. No, well, not quite buried, but definitely this movie was supposed to have, I think, a summer release or a late spring. And then when Columbine happened, the studio completely panicked. There were a lot of studios that panicked over a lot of things when that happened because this was at a time when school shootings were not seen as normal. Um, and when it came out, there was a lot of debate over it. People were like, this is glamorizing this kind of violence. This is glamorizing toxic masculinity before we really had the term. And then other people more rightfully saw what Chuck Palahniuk and Fincher were going for, which is it's critiquing this type of toxic masculinity and this bravado and critiquing this society that strips not just men but people of so much self-worth they feel the only way they can assert themselves is through violence. I think this film is one that is very critical of violence and critical of the society that we live in today. Again, if we're talking about once again, a movie fairly relevant, Fight Club is one of them. I mean, granted, there are a lot of people who I think love Fight Club and took all the wrong lessons from it, just like there are people who watched American Psycho and thought Patrick Bateman is the coolest guy in the room. But that is not the fault of the filmmaker. I know we have that debate about death of the author, but I do also think there is some responsibility on a viewer to try to read these movies into these movies a little more. Um, I mean, my gosh, I could have a whole program on that alone, but this film was one where the studios were almost scared of it and didn't really know what to do and how to market it. So it comes out, really doesn't make a lot of money, but boy, once you had a bunch of people, including teens like myself, that had allowance money, we went and rented that movie and watched it and were like, this is the most mind-blowing thing I have ever seen in my life. Which again, when you're 13, 14, it is. Um, but this became one of the best-selling pieces of home media in history. VHSs, Blu-rays, DVDs flew off the shelves, and it's still a quoted film. I would say go in, if you've not watched Fight Club, I would say go in with an open mind and go in again, realizing that Chuck Palahniuk wrote this book, and even including that You're Not a Special Snowflake monologue, he wrote that as a critique of society and a critique of some of these men, not as something lionizing. So I would say watch that with that in mind. I still think there is a prescience to this film that I almost don't think we were ready for in 1999. But it's a film that I think it's relevant. It stayed relevant for a reason. Moving on to our final two films, we're almost there. Eyes Wide Shut. Wow, speaking of a movie I wanted to see because I was a little film nerd and I've heard of Kubrick. My parents like, you are not seeing that movie. That is not a movie for you. Which, once again, in their defense, they were right. Eyes Wide Shut, which turned out to be Stanley Kubrick's final film. This was a movie that was buzzed about for many reasons. The fact that Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, who were married at the time, were starring it. The fact that Stanley Kubrick had a reputation for being a perfectionist filmmaker. The fact that it was taking so long to shoot and so long to assemble. There was even talk that had Stanley Kubrick not died, the movie may never have come out because he just wouldn't be done putting it together. So it comes out, and what's interesting about this film is this is a very adult film. This is about lust, this is about desire, this is about sex and marriage. There's this whole thing of, is there a secret society? How much of this is something this character is dreaming? How much of this is real? It's also this idea of this darkness, that this dark undercurrent in society that we don't see but exists right in front of our very eyes. It's a This movie was #1 when it came out, and this came out in July. This would have been, Todd, if this were to come out now, this would be like a November, December release.
I'd say so, yeah. They don't
Yeah,
seem
it's
to be trying to
Oscar
they
movie
seem to kind of
release.
bank on the Kubrick name, but yeah.
Yeah, also, hey, technically a Christmas movie, you guys. If you're looking for an offbeat Christmas film, it's this one. But when it came out, it was debated. There were people who felt like this seems like it was written and even takes place in the 60s. It doesn't feel modern. But this is a film that, again, after 25 years, people kind of look back on it. They're like, this is a great film. And I'd probably say it's this and Magnolia are one of the last times I think Tom Cruise really acted. I mean, my thoughts on Tom Cruise are known, but like there is a vulnerability he has in this performance and his performance in Magnolia that you do not see in him anymore. And it's a shame. And I think this was the movie that made people realize, oh, Nicole Kidman is a fantastic actress. We should start putting her in more things. And then Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman got divorced, and a lot of people kind of speculated that it was because Nicole Kidman started to get more attention for her talent than Tom Cruise. And I think there's some truth to that, honestly. Also, if you would like to see a great picture, go Google Nicole Kidman walking as her divorce to Tom Cruise is finalized. Todd, do you know what photo I'm talking about?
Oh geez, now that you mention it,
Yup.
yes.
Yeah. It's a just go do yourself a favor and Google that. And now you might be wondering, Liz, why aren't you talking about the Best Picture winner of 1999? Well, that's because we are going to finish up talking about American Beauty and asking this question that I think people ask about a lot of Oscar films. Are they really that good slash bad? Now, so I'm gonna say I am a little um biased because American Beauty is written by Alan Ball, and Alan Ball wrote one of my favorite series ever, 6 Feet Under. So I think I have a soft spot for this movie. Um, I hear the thing. I do agree some of it is overwrought, but I think that again, just like Fight Club, and even or stuff like Office Space, I think there is an undercurrent here of, again, the darkness in front of our very eyes that we don't want to see. We don't want to believe the monsters are on Maple Street. That this movie, I think, was almost ahead of its time in a way. So if you're not familiar with this film, this is about a middle-aged man, Kevin Spacey. He's got a wife, his suburban real estate wife. He has a bratty teen daughter, and he's having a midlife crisis. And he decides the way I'm going to deal with that is quit my job, which, Annette Bening yells at him for quitting the job because she's like, how are we supposed to pay bills? Annette Bening's 100% correct on that. He starts working at a burger joint. He wants to buy like a really expensive car, and oh, he wants to have sex with a teenager. Um, yeah. Now, again, this was made way before we all knew what we knew about Kevin Spacey, and I think that has also soured a lot of people to this film. I think justifiably in a way, because it's very hard to watch those scenes now knowing what we know about him. The same way it's very hard to watch Manhattan now knowing what we know about Woody Allen. And just that Woody Allen kept putting it so in our face. But I think what redeems this movie on that front is that at the end of the film, Kevin Spacey's character realizes, oh my God, I can't go through with this. If I do this, I'm a monster. Like, I'm a predator. I need to not do this. He finally has that conscience speak to him, and he just realizes, no, I can't do it. So I think that's what saves this movie from being like, oh, I can't go. Like, The Usual Suspects is the one that where we're like, I can't go back to that. It's done. But there is something about this movie, this idea of these people who so-called like have it all. The 90s were supposed to be such a great decade. Everyone's happy. Then why is everyone so angry? Um, and it's a movie that like it became a cultural discussion. And this wasn't a movie that was hotly anticipated either. This was one that kind of came out of nowhere and everyone started talking about it. And it had people again calling it over dramatic. And by the time the 2000s came around, it was more known for parody than the film itself. But again, this is another movie I would say go back and give it a watch. I do not think it's a perfect film, but I think there's something in it that is, again, pressing it in a way that I don't think we knew back then. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the final paragraph from the chapter on this film from Best Movie Year Ever. So Raftery writes, quote, by then, a backlash against American Beauty had begun to arise. Depending on which detractor you listened to, American Beauty was either too facile or too earnest. Mainly, though, the early bashers of American Beauty thought the whole thing was just too cartoonish. Who would believe that Nazi sympathizers would be living in picket fence America? Or that a middle-aged square like Lester could be such a skeevy creep? Or that everyone in America was just so angry? And looking at that, you might understand why I feel this film is prescient in ways that I don't think we were ready for. And that might be, in a way, the real legacy of 1999 as a movie, as a film year, of it kind of saw that there were some cracks forming socially in some ways, and films were made about that. And they struck a nerve that for some people it was a little too much. And I'm just going to say, look at right here at other releases. I didn't even get a chance to talk about Run Lola Run and All About My Mother, two movies I love dearly. American Movie, if you haven't seen it, great film. The Green Mile, Stephen King adaptation. Dogma, which there's rumors, Kevin Smith has hinted we might actually get a new release for Dogma. Right?
As of last I'd heard, yeah, he's got the rights back after years in Weinstein
Yeah.
jail.
Yeah. Also, we had Man on the Moon, Jim Carrey kind of going dramatic. Not that he already did in the Truman Show, but Jim Carrey kind of continuing to show us, oh, we can actually act. Martin Scorsese had Bringing Out the Dead. We had Summer of Sam from Spike Lee. We had The Straight Story from David Lynch. Or Todd, I put Stir of Echoes in there for you. Would you care to share your thoughts on Stir of Echoes as it relates to The Sixth Sense?
Stir of Echoes is one of those where, again, this is a classic. It's one of those things which it happens non-frequently. It's Your film is good, but it has the misfortune coming out in the shadow of something that wound up just being that much better. And the fact they both had kind of that shared, there's kind of the ghost story, you've got the mystery element of it. Stir of Echoes, like, is not the same kind of a story. Like, the entire upshot is Kevin Bacon agrees to be hypnotized at a party. Suddenly he starts seeing visions of a dead girl and is trying to figure out who this is and why he's now seeing this. But it had enough of a similar vibe to The Sixth Sense, whereas like it just got swept away in the Shyamalan rush.
Yeah. So from the epilogue of Best Movie Year Ever, it says, quote, "What happened to the movies?" asked Kirsten Dunst. Looking at a list of films in 1999, she says, "I was like, how is this even possible? It showed me how poor movies are these days." Raftery goes on to quote John Cho, where he says, "You don't really go to movies for ideas anymore to get challenged the way you used to. They're more like bedtime stories. You know what you get when you're going in, you know what you're going to get, and you get used to that particular feeling." And Raftery talks about some of the things that led to films not being as challenging, or challenging films not getting as wide of a release as they used to. As he puts it, Y2K might not have gone off as expensive, but look what did arrive not long after 1999 ended. The country-splitting court battle of Bush versus Gore, the terrorist attack of 9/11, the subsequent wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the economic implosion of 2008, the years of caught-on-camera police violence against minorities, and the endless procession of hacking scandals and big tech misbehavior. And he does point out that we did get great movies like There Will Be Blood, Children of Men, Get Out, Social Network, Hurt Locker, Wolf of Wall Street, Fruitvale Station, No Country for Old Men. But he says, quote, the modern audiences have an appetite for only a handful of such films each year. For the most part, they want the blue pill version of the world. This is from Steven Soderbergh. I think 9/11, in a very subconscious way, changed the reasons people go to movies. It's an event the country still hasn't processed or healed from, and without anyone saying it out loud, the sense of, well, you go to the movies to escape really increased. People have always gone to the movies to escape, but after 9/11, that feeling really took hold. And that is why I think a lot of people laud 99 as like the last truly great movie year. And I think there are some contenders for great movie years. I think 2006 and 2007 were really good. I think we're going to look at 2013 as a pretty interesting year. I think 2017, 2019 might be. But again, we're going to need a little more time and distance to really see what the impact of those years were. So with that, I will ask if there are any questions. And hey, does anyone have a favorite film from 1999 that I discussed? Because I mean, again, what a stacked year. Actually, Todd, do you have a favorite film of 1999? Or if you had to pick one to save, what would it be?
Ooh. Oh, geez, that's
I know. Oh, it might have to be pick five because I'm
that's
like,
especially if you put
yeah.
it as save. I almost feel like that automatically nets the Matrix a slot, just because again,
Yeah,
you
it's
take
so
that out of
groundbreaking.
there for like film history. That's like taking a key piece out of a Jenga tower.
Yeah, like that's it. Like, well, it's just like when people, was it Kim Newman? He talked about Akira's impact on cinema. And he goes, if there was never an Akira, we wouldn't have had the Matrix. So if we didn't have the Matrix, we wouldn't have a whole lot of other things. Yeah, I think this is a great year. I would recommend reading the book, but more than that, I would recommend going back and watching these movies. I think there are some people who tend to think that Hollywood stopped being a good place of intellectually challenging films in the 70s. And I'm like, no, that included up through the 90s. There was still some good stuff being made. So with that, it's about 7:45. I do want to just say some of the next programs that we're having next year, but next month is going to be the 2024 Cinematic Year in Review. We'll give our top tens. We'll talk about some interesting stuff that happened this year. There were witches, there were sandworms, and there's a little movie called Hundreds of Beavers, which we are going to talk about. And February, I'm going to be talking about James Earl Jones. And in March, I'm going to talk about French director Agnes Varda, who is probably one of your favorite filmmakers' favorite filmmaker. And she is a really critical voice in French cinema and French New Wave films. And so with that, I will let everyone bid everyone good night, and I will see you all next year. And hopefully we go out and support some independent movies. Todd and I are gonna go see Queer this weekend, hopefully if the weather permits.
Great list, Liz. Thanks so much. Lots of
I
things.
know. I was reading that book and I'm like, I can't talk about every film that
No.
comes out this year, or we're gonna be here all night.
Yeah, no, that was a great exposure
But
to things we needed to be reminded of.
I know. Well, that's why I think it's such a great year but again, I just go back to that epilogue where that Soderbergh piece where he goes, I think 9/11 kind of broke, basically 9/11 somewhat broke the film going audience. But look, I'll say this. I say this as someone who likes fluff as well as difficult films, but I think a lot of people have said you need to have a balanced entertainment diet.
Mm-hmm.
And there's always, I think, room for a film or a book or a television show or just a piece of art to challenge you and maybe even repel you just as much as there's room for something to comfort you.
Right. Well,
Well,
thank you very much again. We'll look forward to next year.
all righty. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night.